Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for this special event, an evening with Sandra Cisneros. I'm Ramiro Salazar, Director of the San Antonio Public Library, and we're broadcasting this evening live from the beautiful Latino Collection and Resource Center at the beautiful Central Library here in San Antonio, Texas. Tonight we host world-renowned author Sandra Cisneros to discuss her latest book, Martita, I Remember You. Martita, te recuerdo. Sandra, as you all know, is internationally known, award-winning author, is recognized in many countries. In fact, her books are published in many languages. Sandra was also awarded the prestigious MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. And again, as I indicated, her books has been translated in many foreign languages. Just a little bit about the book, because you'll hear more about it as the program proceeds. Martita, I Remember You, Martita, te recuerdo, was released this September. It's available in bilingual edition in print and online, and it's available in your San Antonio Public Library. I want you to know that. If you want to place a hold, you can go to mysapl.org to reserve your copy and pick it up at any of your neighborhood libraries. We're pleased to have John Phillip Santos, who will serve our moderator. John is an author and filmmaker. He also brings many credentials. University Distinguished Scholar at the University of Texas at San Antonio, the Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and the recipient of the Academy of American Poets Prize in Notre Dame. Again, John is well known here in San Antonio and beyond San Antonio. We're happy that he will be moderating this evening's event. So with any program, we have to thank our partners, because it's through the support of our partners that programs like this are made possible. So I will start with thanking the San Antonio Public Library Foundation, the UTSA Honors College, and the Twig Bookshop for sponsoring this event. Thank you again, and enjoy the program, and I'll pass it on to John.
Que gusto. Thank you, Ramiro. Thank you very much for having us here in the historic Latino Collection Center at the Downtown Public Library. A couple of quick housekeeping notes for all of you tuning in, and there are legions of you tonight. Spanish language interpretation is going to be available, so if you want to access that in your webinar controls down at the bottom of the screen, click Interpretation, look for the little Mundial symbol, and select Spanish or Bosnian or whatever the case may be, whatever language you want to be interpreted for you tonight. If there's technical difficulty or if you need assistance, you can chat directly to our host for some support. And we're going to have a quick chat in the next minutes. Maybe about halfway through the hour, we will ask you to present your question. So use the chat function. You're not going to be able to unmute or speak during the program, so the chat is where you can ask questions as we get to the Q&A section, and we'll get to that and do as many questions as we can. Que gusto to have Sandra Cisneros in her other hometown, one of her several hometowns, San Antonio, Texas. You know, Sandra, we met here many, many years ago.
1984.
Many years ago. We won't detail the
1984 in January.
1984, and it was a fateful meeting to meet a writer in bloom in the way that you were then, and the stories that were already in play with the House on Mango Street, so many stories to come.
I appeared the same month that House on Mango Street was born.
That's right, it had been published by Arte Público, so before its second incarnation, but it had been published by Arte Público, so you were already an exemplar to us. You were a published author, you had struck it big.
No,
and,
todo lo contrario, todo lo contrario. I came and fellow writers made fun of the book because there were so many typos. And they also said, this isn't a Chicano book. And, you know, it says not a book about La Raza. And I got a lot of criticism. And the book really didn't take off till 10 years later. But it did have a kind of underground following, thanks to you educators out there. Why, and the librarians, who I thank with all my heart, because they are the ones who launched House on Mango Street. It took 10 years to do a little small press book, but it wasn't recognized as like an overnight success unless you count 10 years as overnight.
Well, to quote George Lopez, so you learn. So San Antonio learned, and the world learned. It took them a little while, but they came around.
Yeah, but the funny thing was, it wasn't all the writers that gave me flack, because I met you, and you were one of the few writers. You were one of the few people, Cesar Martinez, you, Dr. Ellen Rojas Clark, who became friends immediately, welcomed me, and have been my friends ever since, my true friends. So thank you for that.
Kindred souls, and the belief you had already, which was such an inspiration, the belief you had that we could live the life of a writer, that we could walk that walk out of who we had been, born into the world that we were born into as the Mexicanos that we were in our nacimiento. Where were you that moment when you came to San Antonio in your journey as a writer?
Well,
Where
this
was
is the thing. I had just finished House on Mango Street in 1982, November 30th, and there was a delay in publishing because we were waiting for illustrations. For the small press edition was supposed to have illustrations inside. So if you have that small press edition, you'll see there's some blank pages that we were waiting from the visual artist that did the cover, Alejandro Romero. And he didn't deliver the drawings. He got one or two done that are now in my archives at Texas State, San Marcos. You can see them.
The Whitliff, yeah.
Yeah, at the Whitliff Center. So I had finished the book November 30th, and then I had a rail pass, and I started traveling the worst possible time, the beginning of December. And I was in meandering throughout Italy and France, and wound up in Paris. And a lot of my crummy memories of being broke and cold in Paris are in this book.
Yeah.
And I gathered, I had just finished House on Mango Street, but through some, this was before ATM machines, through my inexperience of how to acquire my NEA funds that were in a bank in Greece.
Yeah.
I was running out.
So that's the backstory.
I was running out of cash, and I was not 20 years old. I was 28, going on 29. But I attracted friends who were like 10 years younger, and so my story here is about that period, right before, like the year, 13 months before I came to Texas.
I remember, when we met, your stories of Paris and Bosnia and Sardinia, and I thought, this is another kind of Chicana writer here. That,
I remember coming to San Antonio in January, and it was gray and cloudy, and I didn't have money for a car, and I had a little bike that I bought for $25.
And you lived in a little house behind the house? And I lived in a garage
apartment that Naomi Nye told me about, and near Breckenridge High. And I had no money to get a car, so I would ride, over the railroad tracks down Guadalupe Street. Not going over the bridge, but over the tracks to get to the
For your job at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center.
On the west side. And, it was a really tough year for me because I had come from living a year in Europe where I felt very free. And then I came to San Antonio, and, men would slow their pickup trucks and go, "Hey, baby, you like how your tits jiggle," or something equally obnoxious and scary. So I was frightened. And, I thought, what do? Well, I put my Walkman on, and the song of the season was "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." So I would listen to Cyndi Lauper and, "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." And I just to black out the comments from, the pickup trucks. And then by the time I got to like the railroad tracks, I would listen to Stevie Wonder, "Life of Plants." Isn't she lovely? And all this was going on in my head, and meanwhile, it was just the opposite of my life. And I thought, where have I landed? It was so a time warp for me.
Yeah.
It seemed that women were 50 years behind the times. And there were no bicycle riders at that time. So I felt frightened and also misunderstood. And I felt that my book wasn't welcome, that I wasn't welcomed, even though I had done a lot of community work. I wasn't looked at as a colleague and an ally, but I was looked at as an adversary. And I don't know where that came from, because I, was, as my friends in Chicago will tell you, I did a lot of grassroots work. So I felt as if Texas or San Antonio gave me a very xenophobic welcome, except for a few exceptions. The painter Cesar Martinez, you, and Ellen, who are still, supporters.
But, I remember that little apartment, the garage apartment in the backyard.
Yeah, that was the apartment where I first saw the flora and fauna of Texas. Those giant cockroaches that were coming out, and I had to take the phone book and
But I also remember, what I remember distinctly about that space was, this is a writer's place. I remember your, I think it was maybe still a typewriter. I think we were still in the typewriter days.
Yes.
So you were committed to a path.
I had milk crates, bookcases, my little bicycle, a door on some horses, a futon. I didn't have a lot, and a cat, and a little one-bedroom attached to a garage that housed all these giant prehistoric cucarachas.
These were the pre-Chihuahua days. The Chihuahuas hadn't, the Chihuahua menagerie hadn't entered the plot line yet.
No.
But so much was to come,
Yeah, but I had such a hard year. I cried every day at my job, and I would lock myself in the bathroom and bang on the paper towel dispenser and say, you can't quit. You have to stick it out at least a year, because any job where you quit less than a year looks bad on your resume. And it was really hard for me, because I felt like I was out of my element, and I just would tremble and with rage. And you know how when you cry when you're a woman, sometimes you cry because you have coraje, not because you're sad. And it was like from rabia, from rage. And I thought, oh, they're not going to let me, they're not going to see me crying. So I would just have a lot of coraje, and I'd ride my bike. Isn't she lovely? Right. And then I'd get to like the little bridge over there, the Henry Bridge. And then I'd go down to the river and just weep until the river, and the river would kind of heal me and say, yeah, no, it's hard. But after 1 year, when I did the Small Press Book Fair, which was like my first success, then I said, okay, now you can go. And I resigned, but kept coming back. I kept coming back. I was getting ready to leave, and I won the Adobe Paisano Fellowship just as I was packing. And I thought, oh no, I got to stay in Texas. But going to the Adobe Paisano was like sending me to a sanatorium, because I needed to heal and feel that I was connected to nature. And it was the first time I noticed how beautiful Texas was, looking at the clouds and sitting in those Adirondack chairs on the ranch and writing again. It was.
And didn't you have some contact with, was it Dobie's ghost, or was it
somebody's ghost? Yeah.
Or
I don't
duende
know
of some
who's
sort?
ghost, but I remember I had a roommate, because my mother said, you can't live in the country by yourself, or city people. And so I invited 2 different artists to alternate and stay there with me. And one night I was writing an MLA paper, my first MLA paper, that Professor Tiana Rebolledo invited me to be on a panel. And I remember it was really late at night, and the best lighting was in the kitchen over the counter. And then I heard some footsteps going down the hall by the bathroom, and I thought, oh, that must be my roommate. And the next morning I asked my roommate, did you get up in the middle of the night? No. So I didn't think about it. But then the ghost got into bed with me. Now
what?
Okay. Now I don't know who it was. I'm not saying.
We can imagine.
But one morning, something got into bed with me, and I was half asleep, and I put my arm behind me, and I lovingly squeezed its mushy thigh. Then I woke up, and I thought,
definitely Dobie then.
Who was that? It was a loving ghost. It was a loving ghost.
As I would imagine J. Frank Dobie's ghost might be.
If it was him.
Yeah.
But he was a little fresh. Yes.
Well, but San Antonio found its way into your work. I mean, in Woman Hollering Creek, in in Caramelo, there's even a little
Yes.
cameo appearance of San Antonio. So it was a kind of
Baptism by
symbiosis with,
fire.
well, the two, you and San Antonio became locked in a extraordinary
lucha
dance.
libre.
And
And Jacob and
we were
the
talking
angel.
earlier about, you know, especially the revival of Dia de los Muertos and the role that Danny Lozano played and all
Yes,
that. And
well,
you
Danny
were,
Lopez Lozano, who we have to explain,
Yeah.
was the proprietor of a little store called Tienda Guadalupe, which is now an oyster bar on the corner of Beauregard and South Alamo. And thanks to Danny Lopez Lozano, he created a salon of artists. It was like a little tiendita that people would catch up with gossip and maybe buy something and sell something. And because he created this salon, San Antonio started to look good.
yeah,
And also, it helped that he was gay, so he had a fascinating way of being that was very inspirational for other
Yeah.
artists. Like, you could be a writer, and you could be a sculptor, or you could be a painter, but all of us intersected with Danny. And if Danny started decorating his shop with Buddhas, and sure enough, we all started using Buddhas in our art. You know, if he did a Day of the Dead altar, sure enough, we all did Day of the Dead
Yeah.
altars. And he was the one that brought back lost traditions like Day of the Dead
yeah.
in San
Yeah.
Antonio, the
Which has
procession.
become huge here in San
Yeah,
Antonio.
he did that. He started that. And then he spawned artists who looked up to him, like Franco Mundini and Infinito Botanica,
Yeah.
and other artists that nowadays have created their own art, like
Yeah.
Augusto Cuellar,
Yeah.
David Zamora Casas, Ito Romo. Many of us got inspired by that community.
Well, it's just a magic time. You
Yeah,
cover
it was
a lot
a
of
magic
these
time.
stories in A House of My Own,
Yes.
stories from my life.
Yeah, and there's a
extraordinary.
volume 2 of that coming out.
Oh,
in the
can't wait.
future.
We can't wait. But, you know, that interaction with the city and its denizens was transforming. It brought artists
I don't
forward,
think-
writers forward.
I think we were lucky at a time when San Antonio was affordable, and
That's true.
before it
Yeah.
became a big city,
Yeah.
when it was still Lane,
Yeah.
and now it's LeMay.
Yeah.
Now it's LeMay, thanks
Yeah.
to Augusto
La May,
Cuellar.
oh, keep San Antonio La May, of
Mhm.
course, yeah.
Because I got
Great.
it, Augustine,
nice upgrade.
Augusto Cuellar's shop
Uh-huh.
at the Blue Star, which I recommend for all you fashionistas.
uh,
Run over there. Yes.
So, getting to Martita, I remember you. As I was reading this book, this extraordinary book, I was thinking about this time, in that period, these stories you brought about being a Chicana who had traveled outward into Europe and into the Mediterranean world and had brought back these stories, and they were percolating, and now to see them, you know, in this book so many years later, and you know, it was really moving to see how, as an artist, you transmuted those memories into this tale. And you know, as I was looking at this book, you know, again this weekend, and knowing you're also a big film fan, you know, that you're people might not know you're a big cineast, a big filmophile. This book sort of struck me as a kind of a nouvelle vague, a French new wave film. It has this quality of being, nothing needs to be detailed or pinned down. We can move, the camera moves very quick, the camera of your narration moves very, very quickly. So details of the lives of Rufina and Paola and Martita sort of pile up as we're kind of moving through these swift vistas of Paris and the misadventures with, you know, Argentinos and Italianos and Griegos. And I'm wondering whether that was something that was conscious about the way this seems like a very new voice for you.
Well, you
It
have
has
to remember,
cinematic and it's...
I don't know if you know this, John Phillip, but this story was supposed to be part of Woman Hollering Creek.
Oh,
I wrote it at the end of the 80s,
Oh, wow.
beginning of the 90s, when Random House gave me a break and bought the rights for House on Mango Street. They bought the rights for my next book.
Ah.
That was the good news. But the bad news is I had to write it. You know, the next book is like,
Oh,
oh,
that's a terrible
I was
part.
running around like that Energizer bunny, like, oh my God, I gotta get this book. And they already gave me an advance, and I'd spent it living in San Antonio, so I was like really frantic. And I would just, I was trying to write a Noah's Ark of all the stories that Latinos had ever lived, because this was going to be a book that was going to be published by Random House. I wanted to include everyone's story. And of course, I included my own story of like being in Paris. But the original story only had the Paris part.
Yeah.
And it stopped at the New Year's Eve party.
All right.
Without giving too much to people who haven't read the book. It's a sandwich. You know, it begins in Chicago, and then there's a Paris part, and then it ends in Chicago. And I only had the Paris part. And my publishers and my agent looked at the story, and they said, you know, all the stories in this collection are about Texas or Mexico, and this one is about Paris. It doesn't quite belong. And you know, I thought,
Argentinians.
yeah, well, you know, I thought, yeah, that's true. And they didn't like the ending. They said, you know, you need to develop it more. This isn't the ending. And I said, oh, okay. So I put it aside. But I always liked this story. It's been a favorite of mine in Deep Freeze. So I went into Deep Freeze, and I took it out of Deep Freeze after I finished this book, which I just, you know, finished this one, I think 2015, 2016. And so out of storage came, you know, I always have lots of projects. I have more unfinished stuff. But anyway, I took it out of Deep Freeze, and I worked on it, and maybe I needed time. I couldn't see the ending when I was I was having too much fun running around with all the artists and getting on my bike and driving to the Bonham Exchange and dancing with the entire room, and getting back on my bike. And it was really safe then. I could ride at night and go home, and, you know, it was just a different time. So now that I live in Mexico, in San Miguel de Allende, I finished the book. And I feel that I needed to be an older woman to have the perspective of what it means when you're young and you are a young writer and you do foolish things so that you could prove to yourself that you're a real artist. You know, you do foolish things that you think about, oh, I could have gotten murdered, or worse, I could have gotten raped in that situation. But you so much want to live like a writer. And if you're a person of color and a working class person, you don't know how to become a writer. Where are our models?
Yeah.
Do we have to marry a writer or an artist like Frida and then have him on our head all the time and cause us a hysterectomy? How do we become artists when we come from working class homes where mother and father don't want us sleeping on the floor and living in another town and not having kids? Like, what are we doing? We went to college for this? You know, that was to me the terrible time in the 20s, because you're trying to cumplir as a daughter. You're always trying to please your father and please your mother and please your religion and please your culture. And it isn't until you get, like, you know, slapped in the face when you're 30 and you think, I've spent 10 years trying to please everybody, but no one has asked me, what do I want? And worse, I haven't asked myself. That's the scary thing. So I think I needed to go beyond my 20s and go beyond it and look back and say, who was that girl that was brave enough to buy that one-way ticket from New York to Athens and then get lost for a year, and then come back with $200 in her pocket and borrow money to go to San Antonio? My brothers drove me in a van. They dropped me off. I remember we stayed at some motel outside of town, and we were watching the news, and the question of the day was, should Miss San Antonio come from San Antonio? Call in this number now. And my brothers and I looked at each other.
Yeah.
You were from Chicago. We burst out laughing. And we said, where are we? And that was like my introduction to Texas. I didn't know the Alamo was here. I didn't know what the Alamo was.
So you had forgotten the Alamo.
I couldn't remember the Alamo because I couldn't forget it. It didn't exist in my consciousness. It was beyond, you know. I was like, I remember the very first day I came for the job interview, they said, would you like to see the Alamo? I wanted to say, it's here. Later on, I would have said, is my bike at the Alamo? But that was years later. And, you know, and so they took me to the Alamo. I didn't know what to do. You know, it was like so not my story. I did not define myself by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. I had a completely different sense of self. So I felt like I fell into a time warp. And I remember waiting for the bus with a big cape that I had bought on discount in Milan. It was all lined in real red wool, and the outside was like kind of like spaceship aluminum. It was real bizarre. And I have a picture of me wearing that cape, waiting for the bus, and I thought, I think I'm not dressed for San Antonio.
A big surprise. The first fashion dispute with San Antonio. But Rufina in this story, I guess she's a kind of narrator of sorts. But you know, she's a writer in the making. She's waiting for the check is in the mail from somebody or other to go to a writing retreat.
Yeah, and it was like me. That part was true. I really was stalling because my father was trying to get me to come home, and I was waiting for a acceptance letter from an arts foundation in the south of France. So I did put that. I put my father, the first time I sketched him in literature before Caramelo. I put a lot of my mistakes, my bad sleeping arrangements, people I met were all like based on real people. But then as I gave the story, it's like a kite. You've got to give it string.
Yeah.
And if you don't give it enough string, it just gets tethered into memoir and it's boring.
Yeah.
You have to give it string so it could take off into the imagination. And there's a moment in the story when Martita's talking to her about the magic of making love. And the narrator, Corina Pufina, says, I've never made love. I was shocked because I thought, oh my God, she's not me. And it took off in a different, and that's what you want when you're writing. You want to start from someplace here, but then you want to like lie, you know, and let it take off. And then the more you lie, the more it becomes the truth.
Her destiny, I won't go into detail about it, but her destiny isn't your destiny. I mean, she has a very different
Yes,
path.
but then I realized, you know, when I finished the story that, oh, this is my friend, my ex-student who I tried to groom to become a writer and didn't take the route I took. This is my cousin, this is my mother. There's a lot of people I know who I've written about without intending to write about them because, you know, I just wrote it thinking I'm following and letting the character. You're like a medium. You let the character speak, and you start from a real place. I always start from some place I want to forget, some memories that I want to forget. And then the more I let the character speak, they just take over and go their own route. And I think I'm making it up. But then when I finished with the book, I said, oh, that's like my mom mixed with my student, mixed with my cousin. You know, it becomes this composite.
Well, it's, you know, it has a kind of a mastery about the way that it doesn't seek to control the reader. The reader's attention can shift and move with all of the fleeting references you make to places and moments. And we talked about a little passage.
Yes, and I want to
we can tell what the situation is
right,
when this passage.
I want to remind the readers that I also did the audio.
Wow,
which I do for all my books, but this is the first time I've done the audio of the Spanish.
Oh, wow,
so
great.
The book is translated by Liliana Valenzuela.
The flip side, in Espanol.
Yeah, and Liliana is of course a Texan of Mexican descent. She's
and has
Mexican.
Translated much of your work. So
almost all of it. Yeah. And she and I have known each other almost as long as you and I have known each other. So she did a great job. But usually she would be reading the Spanish, but because Corina, the protagonist, is Mexican American, and Lily has a Mexican accent, we needed a Chicana voice, and so I had to do it. And I was listening to it today. I was listening to it today in the car with my friend Macarena, and it was the first time I heard it. I mean, I've been in the studio recording it, and I did it with 2 actors. So I encourage you to check out the San Antonio Public Library. I'm sure that you can get the audio here, ¿verdad, Ramiro? You have the audio here at the library? Yeah, it's really well done, and it's like listening to a radio play, so do check it out.
Well, and like I say, the movie at least unfolded for me like a really cool French movie.
Like I'm so glad. Ojalá somebody makes a wonderful movie. My dream is that someone makes it into play. because it's the right length that your butt can endure.
Yeah.
It's the right length. It's only 50 pages or an hour and a half.
A monologue? A one-person show, perhaps?
No, 4 actors, 3 women, 1 man playing all the male parts. But I'm putting that idea out there, somebody. Okay, here's a section of the story, and the story is about a woman who wants to be a writer, and she's with no money. She's stuck in Paris right before Christmas. So this is a scene kind of like Charles Dickens' novel, where she and her friends Paula and Martita are out in the streets of Paris in the cold. And I'll just read just one vignette. On Christmas Eve, no one invites us to dinner. Marta and Paula and I meet at Boo with a paper bag of walnuts, a demi-kilo of tangerines, a bar of Swiss chocolate. We look in the bright windows, an Indian shop full of gauzy fringe scarves, leather strings of brass bells, patchouli incense, wicker baskets, rattan chairs. A woman selling roasted chestnuts, open-air stalls with great downy geese hung by their feet, flaccid necks, pheasants with all of their plumage, waxy wheels of cheeses as creamy as calla lilies, chocolates wrapped in gold foil, blood oranges from Spain, green bananas and mangoes from Senegal, avocados from Israel, Greek pistachios, feathery tulips the color of flamingos on thick green stems, shops with silk camisoles and scented drawer paper, soaps that smell of carnations, little bunches of lavender tied with ribbon, a peach parasol lampshade, a white iron bed with an antique comforter, and linen all cutwork and edged with Battenberg lace, and Marilyn Monroe alarm clocks. Look, look, Martita. You bury your head on my shoulder and say, please, can't we go now? I'm so cold.
So beautiful. Very Truffaut-ish, very Godardian, the pens, the jump cuts. I just thought that in this book you gave yourself a new kind of freedom about using that kind of litany of imagery.
You would see it in Carmelo later, but it began
some of it's
here.
there as well.
Yeah.
And the epistolary, the letters exchanged between our sisters in this story.
Continents, yeah.
And then the fact that it's this Mexican American young writer in the making, and her kinships with an Argentinian woman, with an Italian woman, a kind of a globalized chicanexidad, that was itself already prophetic.
This is the thing. When I was traveling, the women who didn't have anything gave me the most. Everywhere I went, regardless what country, even if I met them just for one evening or one afternoon, they were kind and helpful. And when you're traveling and don't have any money, the biggest expense is your hotel accommodation. So, when men gave you a room in their one-room lodging, they wanted something in return. Whereas the women gave you and never asked for anything back. There was a generosity in the women that I felt as if we were all from the same country of women. We were all from the citizens of womanhood. And it made me so grateful for the kindness that strangers gave me when you're almost homeless and people give you anything small without asking anything in return. It reminded me of my father traveling as an immigrant when he came up during World War II, and stories he told me of kindness from people from Texas, people from Dallas, and a man from the Marfa region. He told me stories. He had great stories of when he was down and out and didn't know what to do, of people helping him. And I thought of him when I was traveling in Paris, and it has reverberated with me now when we have so many immigrants coming into this country and into Mexico. We have them on the railroad tracks, and they hold up their IDs from Nicaragua, from Honduras, from Guatemala. And at first I didn't know what it was, because they're standing there, and I said, what? Oh, they're immigrants. I say, stop the car. And I always give them much as I can. And I say, que la Virgen te cuide. Soy hija de inmigrante. And, you know, I feel that if you've ever been in a situation where you have been a stranger in a strange land, you will never forget that. And I think that we are a country who has forgotten that we are a country of immigrants. And it's those who have drifted away from their own stories and their own culture. If you forget your stories, then you know you are doomed. And I feel like my father's stories reverberated when I was living in Paris, and now when I'm living in a time of global migrations.
There's a quality in the story alongside the kinship of the women, the nucleus of the story, the exile, the refugee, the excluded, the outsider. You know, I mean, it may be not surprising that such an upheaval, your literary work, you know, would come from our women writers. You know, it would come from our gay lesbian writers. I mean, that was one of the upheavals in response to maybe movimiento writers, where it was...
I think I felt more at home in the gay community in San Antonio. There was a reason why I had to go to the Bonham Exchange and dance with the entire room every Saturday night, because I felt like we were exiles from our own family. Gay men, of course, because of the homophobia, and me as a feminist from my family that didn't get me. And then, of course, I was an oddity just being in Texas that didn't understand where I was coming from. So I felt, and I need to write about this for the next book of essays, how important the gay community was and is to keeping me afloat.
And Latinx letters.
For helping me navigate the most difficult times in my life.
The mujerismo and the joteria were the two major forces in this literary upheaval.
Yes.
And we thank you for part of that.
Well, I'm so grateful that I met you, because I might have left town after the first weekend if I didn't have friends like you. And
I did leave town for a while. So.
You have to tell the story.
My
that you
exile,
applied for the same job, and I got it.
That's right.
But you were still my friend.
That's right.
It just goes to show what a
and it shows they picked very well. We were competing for the same job. So send your questions in now. We'll get into questions from the legion of you watching, and thank you for staying with us. A teacher asks, Sandra, what advice do you have for young writers about how to find their stories?
Okay, well, I think it's important when you're writing to go to the stories that have the most power. And by that, I mean the ones that you wish you could forget. Not the ones you remember and you're all happy and you're talking about, but the ones you don't talk about, the stories that have censored you and are choking you and are killing you because you're silent. Write about the stories you wish you could forget. And write them as if you're talking to the one person you could confide in if you were wearing your pajamas. Use that voice as your first draft. Doesn't mean it'll stay in the pajama voice later, but it helps you to get a first draft and to be able to speak if you will write something in a voice, with an intimate voice you would use in your pajamas, not your book voice, but the voice in your kitchen table talking to one person, and write about the things you wish you could forget. And also, if you would write them in buttons as opposed to from the beginning to the end, write the scenes that are the strongest, you know, the dialogue or maybe a smell you remember. Use your five senses. Don't write them in order. Just put them all down, and then later on you can move them around. Often I write things in little buttons, little vignettes, and then I just collect them all, and then I move them around. So that way you're not thinking, oh my God, what's the first line? What's the opening? What's the closing? We don't think like that when we're writing. We are giving ourselves permission to write from our hearts. And the things we wish we could forget, they're going to come out like a tsunami. So that's what I'm going to recommend.
There's a question here, I'll expand on it. Do you handwrite any work? I know you have a lot of different rituals about your writing space and your implements and such. You gave me an invaluable tip very early on that I always share with writing students. three-hole paper.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
The three-hole paper equation. Anything you do it on three-hole paper.
Yeah, but you taught me that they print three-hole paper, whereas I was punching the holes
yeah,
a long time.
as a way of collecting your material. But talk a little bit about your writing space, what you need to
I
get
write buttons. Sometimes I write them longhand.
motion.
Sometimes I text them in my phone, so I have little notes. But I only text notes in my phone or on my notebooks. I generally do the longer writing, and then I just write them. You know, I like to print them up, and then I move them with the other. I have a ring binder when I have a big project, and then I can move things around.
And what's your writing space in San Miguel? Is it?
Well, right now I don't have an office. I used to work on my dining room table on a little Texas table with a soda pop opener in my inner living room. But as of COVID, everything like Command Central moved to my bedroom and to my bed. But I just decided, like last week, that I'm closing up my guest room and making it my office because I really need an office.
Very good idea.
And I don't need any more guests. I need an office. And I've just been like closing up that room for people to come and visit. But, you know, I've had enough guests. I need to have a room that is welcoming to my animals. I need to have my animals because
the current menagerie.
Four,
names
two chihuahuas and a little hairless dog and a dachshund.
Let's have everybody needs to hear the names.
Luz and Osvaldo. Nahuilin is the hairless dog, and the newest dog from the Mexican photographer Flor Gardoño. She gave me my dachshund, and her name is Pufina, after the character in the book. Puppy Pufina is the newest acquisition. She's 5 months, and I need them because writing is so solitary. And, you know, a lot of times you just need to have somebody sleeping, and you don't want them to talk. And pets are perfect. And now he likes to sit on my lap. She's usually at all my Zooms. Or she's not here today, but she's in another country. But I like having their energy, you know, because sometimes you can get really caught up in the work and you feel depressed. And then you look at your dog and he's doing something goofy. You start laughing and you realize, oh, it's okay.
Here's one that really speaks to the power of Martita, I Remember You. What advice would you give your younger self when you were still unpublished and just starting out? So the book itself.
Not have an affair with a professor or with a published writer. That does not make you a writer. It harms you and damages you for life. And I made that mistake. I think, me? He's selecting me? You know, oh, well, that's another essay, and I will write about that in my next book of essays. I'm not ashamed or proud of my younger self's mistakes because all those mistakes led me to who I am now. But you should not mistake the attention of someone who has power over you. Even if you are technically an adult, you are not an adult when you're with a famous person because you look up to them and think that if you get involved with them, you will become them. And I regret that I was so young and naive. I was younger than my years when I was 21, 19, 18. I was very protected, as many Mexican-American daughters are. And I feel damaged still. I couldn't write about it when I was living it, so instead I took a younger voice and I wrote a story about a girl and the shame she felt about her house and her neighborhood, rather than the shame I felt as a young woman having an affair. But I tried to write poems about them, and they weren't working. I want to write about that time in my life when I'm not angry, and I'm not angry now. So it's something that I wish I could forget, and I want to write about it before someone else does it for me.
And this book, you know, has a kind of elegiac quality. It's an elegy for a moment in your journey, a moment in maybe collective sense of women's journeys,
you know,
but there's an elegiac quality to it.
Well, you know, I didn't realize I was being interviewed by Chiara Alegria Udes, who wrote In the Heights, and she asked me some really funny things, like, why is she so naive? How come she's never writing if she's a writer? Only a writer would ask this question. And I said, well, you know, I'm still kind of naive.
Personal.
I'm still like the most naive human being I've ever met. So like I'm like this eternal child. So I can understand that girls that are brought up by protective parents and protective, you can be living in a very rough neighborhood but be very protected. And I was that way. So it was a real shock when I went out to the world and, you know, I wanted to live it up. And Girls Gone Wild, you know, so there was like a reaction to my Catholic school upbringing and my very traditional daughterhood. So I don't know, I feel as if I'm still an inocente, but I like my innocence because I believe that the world is still good, that even with everything awful that's happening, I heard about a doctor who works with the foundation of Any Baby Can today, Dr. Mitchell, and he donates all his time in these little rural communities in Texas for free. And man, restored my faith in humanity. You know, that I need to know that there are people doing good things in Texas.
You know, I mean, Pafina, there's a moment in the book when Pafina in Paris is fondly, maybe sentimentally, thinking of the tamalada happening at her house in Chicago. So she's cosmopolitan, but she still has, you know, tamal fever.
Well, this is the thing. The thing I liked about the book is that we finally see, you know, Chicanos in Paris. You know, because I did run into Mexicans when I was traveling, but I didn't run into any Chicanas. And this was 1982, you know, 1983. And I think it's important that, you know, we see some working class people in Paris. I remember when I met Danny Lopez Lozano and ran with the artists here in San Antonio in the early 90s, I would think, this is better than Paris in the 20s. We are living in a glorious moment in San Antonio history that one day we'll look back and say, it was like, you know, the left bank in Paris. And I knew it when it was happening. And a lot of those relationships and friendships fell away. People moved away. People do different things. But I think that when I was younger, me was looking for the glamorous Paris of the 20s. And I found it in San Antonio in the 90s. The beginning of the 90s, you know, that's kind of
singing arias from balconies in downtown San Antonio.
Yeah, we used to have great, you know, we would go to the O. Henry Bridge at midnight on my birthday and drink champagne, or we would go to the San Antonio River to where the theater is, and everybody would bring a biodegradable symbol of what you wanted to let go for the new year. We had wonderful gatherings. They were so good that everybody else's parties were boring.
Yeah, and people don't realize, or they don't remember as much the time before there was papel picado everywhere, and Dia de los Muertos was an epic, and
epic things.
And y'all had such a pivotal role in reimagining the city in that period.
Yeah, it was an exciting time because we were inventing it, inspiring one another, and I realized, oh my God, Paris wasn't Paris, this is Paris. But it became that because of the artist that revitalized Southtown, revitalized King William, created a beautiful hive of creative individuals who inspired and sparked one another. And it wasn't just the artists, of course, it was the music scene, you know, the accordion players.
And lots of escándalo, lots of scandals and furious contestations.
And hanging out at the old Liberty Bar. I think we made it tilt. I think it was straight until after we got through with it.
The tilt definitely set in deeper.
I want to write about these places.
Well, maybe we need a movie. We need a. But you know, all the names can be changed. And hey, so here's a very heavy question. How can we battle machismo and make reading cool for everyone?
Well, reading is cool for everyone, and I've met some very cool men that have created podcasts about House on Mango Street and done it from two men from the barrio that I grew up in Humboldt Park. Did this, Nelson and his brother,
What's that called?
Santiago. It's called Homies of Lit.
Homies of Lit.
Yeah, they're really cool guys that talk, you know, like the barrio, and they take apart and talk about male toxicity. They're cool. Yeah, homies of less. One's a writer and his brother's not, and it's great because they're like, they're guys that are talking to other guys about literature. So I think what we can do is get men to do podcasts or to speak out to other guys about their point of view about books. I think that's a revolutionary thing, what they did, to talk about it.
I will seek that out.
Yeah, Homies of Les. It's a Nelson and Santiago, and I just know it's Homies of Lit, and I'm sorry I can't get everybody's name. I got Luis Rodriguez, Jason De Leon, the MacArthur winner who works on the border and death anthropologist. He got me on Hook to the show. And I wrote to them and said, "Can I be on your show?" And then I got Luis on, and
So did you appear on the show?
Yeah.
There's an episode where we can find you?
There's an episode when they talk about House of Manga Street, and then there's an episode where I appear, and I just said, wow, I wish that every university would play this podcast to guys. It's because this is guys talking about guys and talking about their experiences in the neighborhood. It's great.
Is it ongoing, or was it?
You can. I think you can still get it.
Right.
Homies of Lit, and.
It's a penultimate question here.
Well, that's a suggestion.
What has your experience been living in Mexico?
Well, my experience has been living in Mexico that it's not perfect. It's not like the way you see it when you come in as a visitor. But I feel there's some concessions one has to make. Like, if I had to go to Austin, I wouldn't think, oh my God, it's after sundown, I can't drive to Austin. Whereas in Mexico, like, from my town to get to the airport, no, you don't go out and drive at night in those country roads. It's dangerous. And, but on the other hand, there's this idea in Mexico, I don't know if it's the Mexican survival mechanism. When something happens, it's like, oh, well, that's because they were out on Saturday night. What were they doing out on Saturday night? You should go home after dark. And on the other hand, there's a kind of safety that I feel in Mexico in the daytime. And I feel a safety there that I don't feel when I come to Texas. Because, like, I know when I'm in Mexico that I could be sitting somewhere and somebody's not going to go crazy and shoot us all up. Well, maybe at night, but not in the daytime.
Yeah.
And I feel like here in the United States, anything could happen. Anything does happen. Everything does happen in, like, the daylight in every moment. So, like, when I come here, my employees, Ernesto, my assistant, asked me, be careful. Be careful. Aren't you afraid? And he asked me the same thing that people ask me, like, when I go south. Aren't you afraid? I think everybody's afraid everywhere. And I think there's no place that's safe unless you hide under a rock. I think as long as there's human beings, and as long as we're not treating the source of problems for people with guns, that we're going to always live with fear.
Well, we had such a grand visit, really on the eve of the pandemia. One or 2 weeks before the pandemia went down, and I remember these sublime evenings up on your rooftop.
Up on my terrace watching the sunsets.
Maybe more mezcal than I imagined was necessary, but it was incredible celestial displays and fireworks and the sounds rising up.
It's so beautiful. That's the thing about Mexico. It's so heartbreakingly beautiful. And the beauty is like the sky, or the sunset, or a hummingbird, or a mother kissing her baby, or someone knocking on your door selling donuts to raise money for a little sister that needs a computer. Things like generosity and cooperation, that the community comes together in times of crisis. There's a way of aguantando. Mexico endures. It doesn't have a lot, except it's so rich in its spirit. Its spirit and generosity is the richest resource that Mexico has, its spirituality. And to me, if we measured nations by their spirit, Mexico would be a first world nation, and we would be very poor because we don't value or instill humility, cooperation, aguantando, endurance. There might be little pockets here and there, but we don't as a nation. And it's because the country, the people have to aguantar because the government has failed them. The government has failed them, so they have to, okay, let's cooperate You know, an earthquake, forget about the government
they make
saving
their way
you.
through.
I'll use my hands, and I will dig you out. And they help each other, like little ants. And I think that's a heartbreaking and a beautiful thing to see, because I don't know that we've ever done that in the United States. We all fight with each other. We don't come together and cooperate and assist.
Well, it's always so grand having you in San Antonio. Your homecoming.
I love coming back to San Antonio. I get treated better now that I don't live here.
People should know that they can seek out this book in the short term, but on the near horizon. So we have
a new book coming
Martita,
out.
I remember you.
Yes.
The near horizon, a book of poetry.
Next
So
fall.
following up Loose Woman, My Wicked Wicked Ways. The new book of poems is.
It's called Woman Without Shame. But before Woman Without Shame appears in September, there's another book. The new translation of House on Manga Street by the Mexican novelist Fernanda Melchor will be out in February.
Wow, fantastic.
Yeah, so I've got lots of projects. And I'm working on the House on Manga Street, the opera, with Derek Vermel, and it'll be in workshop next year in Chautauqua, up in upstate New York. So we'll be seeing that in the horizon too.
We love you, Sandra. So great to have you here.
Thank you.
Un big aplauso virtual. Yes.